All right. Gotcha. All right. Kyle, you moved up?
Yes.
Gotcha. All right, Colin. Right, Colin? All right. Say everyone's here. Let's go ahead and start. Parasite in the news. This was interesting. Popped up January 22nd. Genetic sequence for parasitic flowering plant sapria. Who's had botany? A couple of you have, I know. You guys covered parasitic plants? Cover this one? This one, yeah, a relative has the flower is like 3 feet long, 3 feet wide. Massive. But parasitic plants are somewhat rare. We have one here. Who knows what it is? It's on campus. I've seen it. It's something that I avoid around the holidays. Mistletoe. Mistletoe. It's in the trees. Look around the trees. I see it in. Well, it used to be where the greenhouse is now. There used to be some trees. You can see it. If it's close down on the ground, you can actually see that mistletoe stem going into the tree itself. Parasitic plant. So what's going on there? And as we'll learn, parasites, depend on their hosts, and this is no exception here. I didn't read the actual article. I just kind of read the news story, and then I read more about this plant itself. It's notable because with the genetic sequencing, they could see what was gained, what was lost on this switch to parasitism. Almost 40% of the genes that are in other plant species are lost. And it seems to be the trend with other parasitic plant species that they've lost these traits. Now, a lot of these traits are tied to, I think they said flowering, or not flowering, photosynthesis. Because these plants are really deriving their nutrients from the host itself. They've tapped in, this one's tapping into both the xylem and the phloem to steal water and the sugars that the plants are producing through photosynthesis. So, if you're taking that energy away, why have those genes? Why maintain those genes? Why replicate that DNA code? You don't need to. So through evolutionary time, these plants have lost 40% of the genes. But that's not the only thing. This one was rather interesting in that it is acquiring genes of its host plant through horizontal transfer. It's taking some of the genes and then integrating it into its own code. I think that is the really cool part about it, because it's like, why do that? Now, the advantage of this for us is that we can now track the host-parasite relationships. We can track what host does it infect or has it infected through evolutionary time, and get a kind of a clear picture of transitions to its current host. So this was in the news. Thought it was pretty interesting. If you're into plants, there's parasitic plants out there. Check it out. I think all you have to do is parasitic plant, and this one pops up right away. I will say that 40% loss is rather interesting. You've lost a huge amount of genes to become this parasitic lifestyle. And we've seen this in other cases. We have a group called the myxozoans. We thought they were, their own phylum. They had characteristics that made it look like it was similar to, let's say, Cnidarians, but the thought was that this was just kind of convergent evolution. You're trying to solve an evolutionary problem, and you developed a similar solution. Genetic analysis of those myxozoans, though, revealed another story. This wasn't an example of convergent evolution, trying to come up with the same answer to a similar problem. Rather, these things are nested within the Cnidarians. So what are the Cnidarians? Jellyfish, anemones, right? They've got nematocysts, right? Cnidocysts. That's what these myxozoans have, and it's almost like you've took this free living style where you need a body form to capture energy, to capture food, and you've lost it because now you're actually residing inside the host where you can absorb your nutrients. We'll probably talk about one of those later this year. So parasites in the news, pretty interesting. Any questions on this, I should say? All right, so we are going to start. And I am live streaming, so it'll get recorded. And unlike my stats class on Monday night, I actually have the microphone working. I didn't realize that until a little bit later. Hold on. Let me change my presentation view because I don't want to use it. All right, that's better. All right, so any of you, I don't know if anyone's watching, but if you happen to miss because you're under quarantine or whatever, or you're not feeling good and you choose not to come in and watch a lecture, you can always type into the chat if you have questions. Kind of relies on me to check it, and since I'm over here by the computer, I should be able to see it. Should be able to see it pretty quickly. All right, so we're in parasitology. General course introduction, read the syllabus. We already went over that. All right, so what we're starting with is this introduction, and what I'm going to say, terminology. This is going to be basic terms. We have to know, we have to understand, because we're going to see it all throughout the course. All right, so what is parasitism? Parasitism, at least our knowledge of parasitism, dates back at least to 1550 BC. It's at least the date of the Ebers Papyrus, which is like a medical document that that collated all the information that the ancient Egyptians knew. Now, this document could have been a copy. Some suggest this was a copy of the original, but it's a collection. It's a collection. It's 110 pages. It's 20 meters long. Massive collection. And in that collection, they actually recognize that there are some organisms that can cause disease and sickness. And that this wasn't really accidental. This wasn't a case where we have a symptom and then sometimes you have this organism, sometimes you don't. But if you have these symptoms, then you have this organism. So they kind of set up this cause-effect relationship where this parasitic organism is causing the maladies that we see in the individuals. Now, they also recognize that apparently this looks to be like some dependence on the host because these organisms weren't being found in some other place. Right? These roundworms, let's say, they were only being found in the human gut, or they were only being found in some of their animals that they raised for food. Right? So their understanding of parasitism was that, yeah, you have this cause-effect. Parasite causes the disease, but then you also have some dependence on the host organism itself. So what is parasitism? Well, it's a form of symbiosis. And symbiosis, if you remember, is basically living together. Right? Living together. Now, there's many different types of symbioses out there. And we're going to kind of review them to see where parasitism fits. Our classification of the symbioses can be grouped by the trophic interactions between our organisms, the degree of harm and or benefit that's exhibited, by one or both. The possibility of death. So is this relationship, does that result in death of one of the individuals? And then if so, if it causes death or if it causes harm in some way, how many different individuals suffer because of it? Is it just one individual that dies, or is it going to be multiple individuals that die? And I will say again, I'm not posting these because I want you to write down and take the notes. If I go too fast, if I flip a slide and you didn't get anything, please stop me and go back. This is kind of my way of helping slow down the lecture, because if we don't, we will cruise through it. All right? So, what are the forms of symbiosis? So, symbiotic relationships, starting at our trophic levels. We can have direct trophic interaction, indirect trophic interaction, or no trophic interaction. On this chart, I've also labeled benefit, harm, or no harm for that interaction. So like +0 for foracy. All right, so first, what is foracy? Well, this is a symbiotic relationship where we don't have any sort of trophic interaction going on. All right, foracy is simply like hitching a rod. You have an organism that's going to latch on to another organism and use that large organism as transportation. All right? What's an example of that? What's an example of this?
The spreading of seed. They just kind of latch on and fall off wherever, but they don't hurt the organism.
Okay.
It's not a parasite.
Yeah, so let's say birdweed. That could be a type of parasitic interaction. Right? Those seeds, they latch on, hook on to another organism, uses us for dispersal. It uses, in some cases, my stupid dog for dispersal. Right? I would have said the classic one is the sharks and the
Remora?
what's that?
Remora?
Yeah, the remora.
Yeah.
Yep. That seems to be, when you talk about foracy, that's a classic one. Why? Because you've got these blue underwater pictures, these big sharks and these organisms, come off of them to feed. But we have several examples of those, and we can really look at the dependence. Now, the interaction is a +0. So the one that hitches a rod, that's obviously a benefit. We've gained a benefit by moving, by using another organism for locomotion or for dispersal. Right? The other organism, one that provides a rod, isn't gained, isn't harmed. It's just, hey, I'm unaffected by it. All right? So that's no trophic interaction. When we have trophic interaction, we've got some sort of benefit arising through consumption of food. So our indirect trophic interaction that we have is commensalism. This is indirect because the organisms aren't feeding on each other. All right? Yet they both benefit in terms of energy acquisition if they live together. All right? In commensalism, you typically have one that benefits and then the other that does not. One that benefits, the other that does not. So, what's an example of a commensal relationship? This is also a classic one.
Tick.
What's that?
A tick. Gone.
Ooh, not quite. Because the tick is going to feed on the dog.
Okay.
Now we have direct trophic interaction. What about fiddler crabs with their little anemone host? That's also a classic one. You see pictures all the time. Yeah, this fiddler crab moving around. It's got on its shell is sea anemone on it. Right? Sea anemone benefits from it because it gets to move around to different places. So if it ends up in a place where there's not a whole lot of food, hey, that's okay because the crab's going to be moving on anyways. So does it hurt the crab? No, not really. Some people would actually argue that that anemone benefits the fiddler crab by providing a level of protection against predator, which would change then our relationship to probably mutualism. But I mean, that's if the predators are there and so forth. So we can kind of view it as a commensalist type of relationship. You do have some things that can live on us, right? That really just feed off of dead skin cells, right? So what are some examples? Some of the lice will feed on just dead skin cells. They don't bite you. Some of the mites that do that. Commensalist relationship. All right. Direct trophic interaction. Now we're going to have our relationship results in direct consumption of food. So mutualism. All right. This is where you actually benefit in your food consumption by being associated with the other who also benefits. All right. In this case, difference between commensalism and mutualism is that both of them benefit in this case. All right. Both organisms do better when they're associated. So if this is a case where the fiddler crab is getting protection by being associated with that anemone, now we have mutualistic relationship. All right. That's a benefit. What about if we cause harm? Well, now that changes our relationships. And now it focuses on exploitation. Our symbiotic relationship is resulting in some form of exploitation. Our exploitation is going to come down to, is it death or is it just harmful? And then how many individuals are harmed by it? So we'll start on the left-hand side. Situation where our symbiotic relationship results in the death of the individual, of one of the individual. So in all cases, one is going to benefit and the other is always going to be harmed. Why is that one being harmed? Well, it's getting killed. All right. Question is, how many individuals are killed? If our relationship results in many individuals being killed, then we're talking about a predator-prey relationship. Our predator is exploiting its prey items by killing them and consuming them. The prey items suffer because, of course, they die. All right? End of life at that point. Our predator isn't just going to interact with one individual. They're going to have to prey on multiple individuals over the course of their life. That's our predator-prey relationship. Parasitoids, on the other hand, are only ever going to affect one individual. Now, remember, this is just going to be our individual that is gaining from our relationship. All right, a wasp goes in, stings a spider, drops one egg. That one egg, as it develops, is utilizing that one spider. In order to get out of its host, that wasp is going to eat its way out and ultimately kill that spider. Does that wasp kill multiple spiders? No, that larvae only kills its one host. All right? It only kills its one host. So that's a parasitoid. Hosts are always killed. The difference between a predator and a parasitoid, how many of them are killed? The other side is when our individuals are seldom killed. Now this is more just harm. We did some harm, but not enough to kill them. And like the left branch, we can have a situation where many of them are harmed or only one. If many of them are harmed, we're looking at a micropredator. It's gaining its food, it's gaining its energy from a host, but it's not just going to be one host. It's going to affect a second host and a third host and a fourth host. Ticks would fall under this micropredator category because the tick can feed, drop off, reattach, another organism feed, drop off, and so forth. All right, mosquitoes, also another micropredator. Neither of these are good enough to kill a host. Now, you may have thousands of mosquitoes kill you, right? If they all landed on you and started feeding on you, that's probably more of a, anaphylactic shock response at that point. But that one individual, that one micropredator is causing harm, and it harms multiple individuals. If only one is harmed, that's our parasite. Why? Because the parasite's going to get in, that one individual is going to get in that host, and it's going to stay there for its lifespan. Now, its life history stages can get out, so its offspring can get out and then go reproduce, get into new hosts, but that adult gets in one host and it's going to stay there. All right, so our parasite exploitation, it's going to seldom kill a host, all right, and only one individual is going to be harmed by it. So, can we get a good definition of it? Yep, we can. So, parasite, and this is in textbooks, is an organism that lives in or on another organism for at least part of its life cycle and causes harm to the host. Both of these are important terms. Or both sides of this "and" are important in our definition. It helps us distinguish between the other symbiotic relationships. All right, so in this definition, we have dependence of the parasite on the host itself. It lives in or on the host for at least part of its life cycle. If it doesn't, if it doesn't require that host, it's not necessarily a parasite. Right? In some cases, you have to be in or on that host in order to continue developing. There's our dependence. And then that second half is it must cause harm to the host. If it doesn't cause harm to that host, then it could be a commensal, it could be a mutualist, it could be a hitchhiker. All right, so we're saying, hey, we have this dependence and we're going to be causing harm. Kind of sounds a little like a predator, but a predator kills the host. Not just, it harms it, it kills it. And then a predator isn't necessarily dependent to live in or on. It could find a different prey item. But for our parasites, we need a host. So that brings up that second part, that causes harm. How do we define it? What is harm? How do we quantify it? Well, this is difficult to do. All right, this is really difficult to do because we could get infected with the parasite and not know about it. I would ask, has anybody been infected with a parasite? But I don't want to. That's probably FERPA. Did you?
Yeah, I would consider lice a parasite.
Yep. Yeah. So lice, pretty common, believe it or not. And my daughter had it a couple times. And it's not a sign of filth, believe it or not. I think a pig pen, somebody like Pigpen always has lice. No, it's not. Totally independent. Just happens. Actually, hair type, thickness, fineness of hair plays a big role in the success of the lice when you get on it. Maybe someone will talk about lice in lab. But anyways, yeah, we have it. It's a parasite. They will feed. At least the head lice, the larval stages do feed on us. That's why you tend to itch when you have it. But if you don't notice that itch, if you don't ever itch, is it necessarily a parasite? If it doesn't cause harm. Another thing, intestinal parasites. Someone could have a roundworm in this class and not know. Someone could have ascaris and not know. Someone could have a tapeworm and not know about it. So is that truly a parasite now? Well, it comes down to that harm. And we can define harm in a specific way, in that it's just a reduction of fitness. And that is specific, yet it's very broad, because what is a reduction of fitness? Basically, if we lose energy in some way, that has resulted in a loss of fitness. We might not see it, but we do have a reduction in fitness. So how I would interpret it is, right now, us here, if we get an intestinal worm, we're probably not going to be harmed by it. But starve ourselves for 3 months, drop down to 105, 110 pounds, and then get that worm, you're going to see some problems. All right? Why? Because that loss of fitness, that lost energy, is now much more significant once our body gets stressed. All right? So what types of loss of energy can we get? Well, parasite could feed on us. Could be feeding on the blood. Could be feeding on epithelial cells. That's one. Second thing, could be stimulating an immune response. Well, just by producing that immune response, we're expending energy. That's a lost energy, that's lost fitness. Repair mechanisms. If the parasite is causing damage in some way, we're trying to repair that damage. Again, loss of fitness and so forth. And we'll hear about these. We'll talk about all of these, all of the harmful mechanisms, and we'll even point out those situations where we don't normally see that harm unless our body's stressed. The other thing is alteration of host behavior. That's a possibility. You'd say, well, that's not really loss of energy, so how is that harmed? Well, it's harmful if that change in host behavior now exposes yourself to a predator. And we have plenty of examples of those, and we'll talk about those. All right? So parasitism, parasite that lives in or on another organism for at least part of its life cycle, and it causes harm to the host. Questions? All right, so we have some clarifiers for parasites, as with anything. All right. So these clarifiers are going to help tell us about the location of the organisms, size of the organisms, and so forth. So if it's on location, we could refer to parasites as being endoparasites or ectoparasites or even mesoparasites. It's all based on location. So endo is inside the body, ecto is exterior to the body, usually on the surface, right? And mesoparasites are those where part of the worm is inside the host and part of the worms are outside the host.
What type of parasites are like that?
So we have some crustaceans where they need, so some of our ectoparasites have to have a way to attach to the host, to hold on to the host, especially if you're in like a turbid environment, let's say an aquatic environment. So if they don't have like a large attachment organ or a very successful attachment organ, sometimes these things have evolved ways where they penetrated and then their attachment organ is actually interior. That anchor is inside the cells, inside the epithelial layer. We'll talk about an intestinal parasite that actually embeds its anterior end in the gut epithelial tissue, and then its posterior end hangs out into the lumen, because that's where the eggs are being released. So, mesoparasites. Typically, the part that's inside is associated with anchoring and attachment. All right, size. Micro versus macro parasites. So micro small, macro large, and really the large versus small distinction comes down to a microscope. Can we see it? If we can see it with the naked eye and see it fairly well, it's going to be a macro parasite. If we really need a microscope to see it, it's a micro parasite. All right, so a lot of our helminths, they're macro parasites. You can see them on the slide. You hold them up, you can see the worm. In some cases, you can see it across the table. You looked at one in zoology. All right, but our protozoans, you can't see them on a slide. You need to use a microscope. Parasitic lifestyle is another one. So now we have obligate versus facultative parasites. All right, so obligate is that the parasitic lifestyle is required. Facultative lifestyle, it's not required. Now, this is for the adult stage. Is parasitism required in the adult? If it is, we're dealing with an obligate parasite. If that adult can actually mature in the environment and reproduce in the environment, but they can still infect a host and reproduce inside the host and get its larval stages outside, it's a facultative parasite. We will see a couple of these. These are nematodes, and it's thought, so in the nematode life cycle, the larval stages are outside. They're free living in the soil. They get to a larval stage, to a third larval stage, and then they wait until they find a host before they continue developing to the adult. Typically, if you don't find the adult, you'll run out of time and you'll just die. You'll use up all the energy that you saved up in like the first two larval stages. All right? But it seems like maybe some of these parasites have evolved a way where they hit a thresh point and they say, hey, I'm not finding a host. Let's start developing outside to adults so we can reproduce. That's a facultative parasite. In that specific parasite, I'll note that it's questionable of what's going on. Is this a case where the parasitic lifestyle is being lost for transition to free living, or is this a free living parasite that we're actually seeing is partially parasitic, and eventually it will become parasitic life form? In that worm, it's kind of interesting because the free living form doesn't actually undergo sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction only occurs within the host itself. We have parthenogenesis in the free living. So obligate versus facultative. And then we also have this last one based on the host, and the only one is this hyperparasite. It's basically a parasite of parasite. Usually these are going to be bacteria and viruses. They infect another parasite, they reproduce, replicate in those parasites. We found some of these by accident, basically. You had, there's a mouse colony in a research lab. The mice had pinworms. They knew about them. Pinworms in mice colonies are pretty common. Once they get in there, it's hard to get rid of because the eggs are as light as dust, and they can just kind of freely go up and infect everything, and they stick, whatever. But in that time, they had an infection develop. They treated their mice colony with antibiotics, and incidentally, those antibiotics killed all those worms. And some people would say, hey, that antibiotic actually killed the worms, let's use it. But when they look at it, it's actually killed the bacteria that was living inside those pinworms, and the pinworms gained an advantage by having those parasites inside of them. So that's kind of interesting. We also have some metazoan species, so some eukaryotes that will actually infect other parasites. So with all these classifications, I know we presented them as individuals, endo, ecto, right, macro, micro, but we can kind of combine all these terms to say, hey, we're dealing with, let's say, an obligate macro ectoparasite. And that tells us that, yeah, the parasitic lifestyle is required. It's a large parasite, and it lives outside the host. Any questions? All right, so what about the types of hosts? The types of hosts really come down to their role in the parasite's life cycle. All right, what role do they play in that life cycle? A definitive host is that host where the sexual reproduction is going to occur in our parasite. And it's important. I didn't just say any regular reproduction. It's got to be sexual reproduction. This is going to be where our meiosis is going to occur. This is going to be where our fusion occurs to form the zygotes and stuff. All right, so the definitive host is basically our final host. This is where our adult worms, our adult parasites are going to reside. The intermediate host is kind of the level before that. So it's going to be the host where we see development, where we see morphological changes in the parasite. But we don't see sexual reproduction at all. Sexual reproduction only occurs in a definitive host. This host could exhibit or could have asexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction is one of these adaptations that increases the chances of transmission. All right, so definitive host, sexual reproduction occurs. Intermediate host, sexual reproduction does not occur. Asexual reproduction could occur, but we definitely have some developmental and morphological changes. And that's kind of important. A paratenic host is a non-obligate host. It's not required for the completion of the life cycle. Right? We see it in that host. The parasite can survive and do fine in that host. Typically, these hosts, you don't have any development or reproduction occurring. This is just like a temporary host. And in fact, when we think about what is the ecological role of these paratenic hosts, its role is to bridge some sort of trophic gap or some sort of ecological gap. So bridge that gap between the two required hosts that are in its life cycle. So our trophic gap is like a situation where we have a required host that is not the prey item of our definitive host. How do you get the parasite between them? Well, if that smaller host gets consumed by a paratenic host, then the paratenic host gets consumed by the definitive host. Hey, now we've just completed our life cycle. Right? It's not an obligate. We don't need that paratenic host. We can complete the life cycle if there's accidental ingestion, but it's there. In terms of the ecological gap, what I'm talking about is more of spatial relationships, ecosystem, habitat relationships. So perhaps your intermediate hosts are living in water, your definitive hosts are living on land. Maybe you need some sort of host that gets you from the water onto land so that you're now exposed to that definitive host. All right, and we'll talk about some of these. Third type of host is a reservoir host. Oh, and with this paratenic host, no development or reproduction occurs. That kind of sets it apart from our intermediate host, where our intermediate host will show some reproduction, some development. What about our reservoir hosts? So the reservoir hosts are presented here because you see that in epidemiology. So a reservoir host is the normal animal host of parasites that will also infect humans. All right. Typically in these cases, that animal host is the primary host, and then if humans are in that area, they can get it. They get infected, and then being humans, we think we are the most important ones out there, so then we ignore the animals and say, well, the animals aren't the definitive host. We are. Those animals are just the reservoir host. Those pose problems for us because if we go out and treat humans that are infected, we don't solve the problem of the parasite. That parasite's still cycling out in the wild animals. We're still at risk. All right. Zoonoses would be those parasites that then utilize the reservoir host and infect us. Schistosoma utilizes these. Zika virus would qualify as a zoonosis. All right. So those are the hosts. Kind of building on. So now let's talk about the life cycles. So we're going to see different types of life cycles throughout this class. These life cycles can differ by the number of hosts. All right. If we have a one-host life cycle, then we refer to it as a monoxenous life cycle. Monoxenous, one-host life cycle. These are also called direct life cycles because you're going to transmit only to one individual, only to one species, only to one host species. And this host, again, remember, we refer to the host as the role that they play in the life cycle of the parasite. So in this life cycle, we only have one host that's required. If we require more than one host, now we're dealing with a multi-host life cycle. A heteroxenous life cycle is also called an indirect life cycle because to go from your definitive host to another definitive host, you have to take an indirect route. You have to go to another host or perhaps two other hosts before you can get back to your definitive host. So direct. You fly direct from here to Dallas, right? And now that we have that second airline possibly coming in, we could take an indirect route. Fly here to Houston and then from Houston to Dallas. Same idea. Same idea. All right. In our life cycle, we have to transmit. All right. We can either exhibit active transmission or passive transmission. And this is in reference to energy. Is energy expended or not? If energy is expended to get to that next host, then that's active transmission. This is going to be energy, more energy than is required just for basic maintenance and survival purposes. All right, so we can sit around all day and not move. We're still expending energy. But as soon as we get up to move, now we expend more energy. That's kind of what we're talking about. That organism, that parasite's utilizing energy to increase its successive transmission. Typically, it's about movement. All right? These guys are moving around trying to find the host. Passive transmission is when our parasite doesn't really expend energy at all. They're expending energy just for survival and maintenance. They're not expending it to find the host. These parasites are playing a sit and wait strategy. They're just sitting around, keeping their energy expenditure low, and waiting for the host to find them. So we got a number of hosts. This is direct or indirect. We're going to use all these terms throughout the class. We got active versus passive transmission, and then we also have host specificity. So host specificity refers to the range of hosts within a specific guild suitable for infection. I'm not going to ask you for the guild. It's an ecological term, but that guild is basically the role an organism plays in that ecosystem. And in terms of the parasites, it is that role that the host plays in the life cycle. And so if our hosts serve as the definitive host, right, that's a guild. The guild is the definitive host. The guild could be the intermediate host and so forth. Could be a first intermediate host, could be a second intermediate host and so forth. A parasite species that can utilize multiple species in the same role is going to be a generalist. A species that can only use one or a few hosts in that specific role, that's a specialist. So lice, head lice, specialists. It's humans. They infect humans, they need humans. They don't infect anybody else. That species that's common on humans anyways. Very specific. Ascaris, we say it as the human roundworm. That's a generalist. Can go into quite a few several different things. Prefers us, but much more of a generalist. I do have a note here that just because you're a specialist doesn't mean you're a specialist all throughout its life cycle. This host specificity refers to that specific guild. It refers to that specific type of host that we're looking at. So you can be a generalist for an intermediate hosts, but then a specialist at the definitive host level, or vice versa. Questions? All right, example life cycles. Here's one. We'll see this. We'll see this again. All right, so our adults are on the gills of this fish. Egg gets released, goes out into the water. Egg hatches, releasing the larval stage. Your free swimming larval stage swims around, finds the fish, and attaches. So what type of life cycle is this? What type of life cycle? It's what? It's a direct life cycle. How many hosts are in it? Just one. So it's a direct life cycle. What's a synonym for a direct life cycle?
Monoxidus.
Monoxidus. All right, monoxidus life cycle. What type of host is the fish? How would we classify this fish? Only have a couple options. Chad, take a stab at it.
Did you say that the parasite is it reproducing from the gills? Or
Yep.
So it would be a definitive?
It's our definitive host. Yep. That larval stage attaches to the host, matures, reproduces, drops the eggs into the water. Yep, that's our definitive host. So what's the mode of transmission from the egg back to the fish? Active. Swimming around, it's going to swim around, try to increase its contact with the fish. All right, so this is our direct life cycle. Here's another life cycle. We'll talk about this parasite too. So in this life cycle, the adults in a bear, carnivore, piscivorous host, Right? The eggs leave with the feces, get into water, they hatch, release the larval stage. The larval stage gets consumed by our copepod. Copepod gets consumed by the fish. We have larval stages that develop in each. Then the fish gets consumed by a piscivorous mammal. What's the type of life cycle? Indirect, right? Multi-host life cycle, heteroxys. This is a bad diagram. I should have picked another one because what type of host is the fish? It's actually on the diagram. Didn't notice that. Second intermediate host. It's an intermediate host, and in this case, it's the second intermediate host because it has to first go into the copepod, transform to this larval stage, and then once it gets to this larval stage, now it can transform to this after it gets into the fish. If it doesn't get to that stage when the fish eats it, that's it. Parasite's done. All right. And what type of host is the bear? It's on this sheet. It's a definitive host. That's where our sexual reproduction occurs. It's going to produce the worm's going to produce the eggs. The eggs are going to leave. So now, what is the mode of transmission from the egg to our copepod? It should be egg to the copepod. Let's fix that. Egg to the copepod. What's the mode of transmission from the egg to the copepod? Active. This guy will learn. It's free swimming. It's going to swim around, try to get it in habitat overlap with the copepod, who will then feed on it, mistake it for some food. All right. What about from the fish to the bear? Yeah, it's passive. So in this case, there is no alteration of host behavior going on. Sometimes the alteration requires energy output, hormonal shifts. But in this case, larval stage gets inside and it insists and it just stays there. So it just waits for the fish to get eaten. All right. So passive transmission. Last life cycle. All right. Frog. That's where our adult worm lives. Egg passes out of the frog into the environment, goes into a snail where it develops to a larval stage. Larval stage then releases a free-living larval stage out in the water, which then sits and gets consumed by our ostracod that develops into this stage. This ostracod can then be eaten by the dragonfly, where it then stays and remains at stage, and the dragonfly then gets eaten by a frog. Or, if the frog is unlucky, it accidentally consumes an ostracod with its next meal, an infected ostracod with its next meal, and our adult worm then develops. So, what type of life cycle is this? Indirect, multi-host life cycle. All right, what type of host is the frog? Definitive host. It produces our egg, gets released. What about the snail? It's going to be our first intermediate host. What about the ostracod?
Second.
It's our second intermediate host. What about our dragonfly?
Parasite.
It's a paratenic host. This is a great example where we don't really need it for the life cycle. Our development can occur from as soon as the ostracod gets eaten by the frog. As long as that mitochondrial stage is developed, we'll develop into our adult. However, how likely is it that the frog eats the ostracod? Not very common. So it utilizes the dragonfly to bridge that trophic gap. Again, this is another case. Are we seeing the addition of a new host in the life cycle right now? Maybe. Maybe it'll be fixed. But right now, we can complete the life cycle in the lab. Mode of transmission from the egg to the snail. It's passive. The egg gets consumed. The egg's just going to sit there. What about dragonfly to the frog? Also passive. Just going to sit inside the dragonfly. And in this life cycle, it's pretty interesting because it gets infected as a naiad, so as a larval dragonfly, and then that parasite persists through metamorphosis of the dragonfly. Pretty cool. All right, so look at this semester. Note, parasitology encompasses all aspects of biology. We're going to talk about ecology, genetics, evolution, cell bioimmunology, etc. All right. And in many ways, this is like this could be almost viewed as a capstone course because we're drawing on all different fields. You're going to see it from other classes coming into this course. what we're going to do is focus on some major themes. You're going to see us focus on morphology and physiology of the worms themselves. All right, what are the structures? What are their functions? We're going to talk about host responses and parasite evasion. Very common major theme. In order to be successful, the parasite has to deal with that immune response. We're going to talk about pathology caused by the parasites, and in some cases even mention treatment. What are our treatment options? And then lastly, you're going to see that we're going to talk about these adaptations for transmission, because if we're having these indirect and direct life cycles, we have to get from one host to the other to be successful. What adaptations are there? How do we do that? And it's a parting shot. Just I want you to always remember that in this class, the host is our habitat. The insides of all of us, our physiology inside of all of us is basically the same. The parasite's going to see very little change between me and Kyle. Now, I might see a change between me and Natalie because we've got different hormone levels. All right, but for the most part, our gut's going to be the same. All right, our blood's going to be the same, and that becomes important. So, if we can develop this intimate relationship between the host and the parasite, then a parasite can actually become successful. All right. So, what we'll do, I'll get this presentation posted. It's already been live streamed. YouTube will start having it go live. If you wanted to go back and rewatch it, you can. Again, I encourage you to take notes by hand and really kind of get those ideas in your head. I'm going to have a quiz. I'm going to get a quiz put together and posted. This first quiz is just going to be over the terminology, kind of drilling home these terms. I didn't get it done today, so it'll probably won't be due until Monday, sometime Monday. All right. Have a good one.